Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.
Welcome to season 12 of Left of Black, and we are honored to be joined today by Professor Richard Brent Turner, who's a professor of African American religious history at the University of Iowa. He's the author of several books, Islam and the African American Experience, now in its second edition, published by Indiana University Press, Jazz Religion, The Second Line, and Black New Orleans, Before and After Hurricane Katrina, also now in its second edition, Indiana University Press, and the just published Soundtrack to a Movement, African American Islam, Jazz, and Black Internationalism, which is published by NYU Press 2021, which of course makes Richard and I label mates over at NYU Press.
That's right.
Of Soundtrack to a Movement, John L. Jackson Jr. writes, spanning several decades in the exploits and activities of various Islamic groups, as well as some canonical African-American figures, this book provides us with a distinctively new soundtrack to the stories we tell ourselves about Black political and religious life. Welcome back to Left of Black, Richard. How are you doing these days?
Oh, I'm doing well.
You know, there's a way when you think about New Orleans, your previous book, and obviously jazz culture, it seems like a natural progression to go from New Orleans jazz to move into this new book, which looks at jazz music and particularly Islam. And the way that you describe this book as being about the golden age of African-American Islam and jazz. Could you unpack that a little bit for our audiences?
Well, you know, I found through a lot of research that these two golden ages, one of music and one of a religion, intersected with one another in so many fascinating ways. And of course, a lot of people are familiar with the golden age of jazz, in which you have some of the greatest musicians of the 20th century playing in the United States, reaching a high point with the music of John Coltrane, but you know, also Miles Davis, Art Blakey. So many great musicians. But at the same time, from my research on African-American religious history, I did find over the years as I was writing this book that there were numerous African-American jazz musicians who had relationships with, Muslim musicians. Some of them converted to Islam. Some of them, like John Coltrane, had Muslim wives and therefore incorporated aspects of the religion into their music, into their lifestyle. So that's where that linkage in the book comes from.
You know, when you think about this era, as you mentioned, a kind of golden age of African-American Islam and a golden age of jazz music, when you think about those names, John Coltrane and Malcolm X, I mean, they are really spiritual brothers, right? In this moment, right? They are the icons of both of those movements. Talk a little bit about the nature of their relationship to the extent that there is one, but more importantly, the way that, obviously Coltrane's music might have influenced Malcolm X, and the way that Malcolm X's politics and rhetorical strategies, might have impacted, John Coltrane.
Well, they were both linked politically and religiously and artistically to this important period of African-American history, from the post-World War I era into the Civil Rights Movement, and then the Black Power movement. And they were both situated in New York City, because Soundtrack to a Movement focuses primarily on jazz that's happening and religious movements that are happening in Boston, New York, and in Philadelphia. And as it turns out, there was a relationship between Malcolm X and John Coltrane. I found through a lot of research that Coltrane actually did say that he was a great admirer of Malcolm X's, political perspectives, and that actually, towards the end of Malcolm X's life, whenever Coltrane was in New York City, he attended Malcolm X's speeches. And then at the same time, I'm trying to make the argument that their, the high point of their greatest works, for Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and for John Coltrane, A Love Supreme, both appeared during the same year. And a number of great jazz musicians, such as Archie Shepp, saw similarities between his revolutionary hero, Malcolm X, and John Coltrane. Archie Shepp, as well as Miles Davis, believed that Coltrane's music represented the very passion, rage, rebellion, and love that Malcolm X preached.
One of the things that your book, Soundtrack to a Movement, reminds me of, and should remind readers, is to what extent, we think about Malcolm X obviously as this incredible political and spiritual figure, but the extent that he was a social creature, meaning that he moved through so many different social spaces. And I think about, for instance, One Night in Miami, the scene in the film where Malcolm talks about being at a concert in Boston where Sam Cooke is performing. And it was a reminder of the ways that, if there was good music to be had by Black musicians, and if they were coming through Boston when Malcolm was there, or New York City when Malcolm was there, or Detroit even earlier, in his Muslim career, he would be in the audience, to listen to those performers. And I don't think we give enough credit to Malcolm X for being an arbiter of Black cultural production in that particular era.
I totally agree with that, because the book starts out actually with looking at the social, political, and cultural landscape of the Black community in Boston in the 1940s. And that's where Malcolm X, when he was a teenager, had a deep, cultural relationship with jazz. He was the great Lindy Hop dancer. He was even acknowledged by Duke Ellington, when he danced before Duke Ellington's music in Boston, as somebody who could tear up the dance floor. And then at the same time, he had a friendship with Billie Holiday. When he went to New York City in the hustling life, to be quite frank, he oftentimes attended Billie Holiday's performances, and Lady Day seemed to really love Malcolm X. So, that's a part of his life that we don't really think about a lot. His relationship to, to the greatest jazz, the greatest music that was performed in this country in the 20th century, in the 1940s and 50s. But it's a very important part of his life. And then when he got out of prison in the 1950s, I found that he returned to to the jazz spaces to begin to recruit new members of the Nation of Islam. And because he had been an integral part of of these jazz communities, as a dancer, as a fan, he had great rapport with young people who were who were involved, who were going to the jazz clubs. He spoke their language. He felt comfortable in the spaces in which they were socializing. And so that's just I believe it's a constant part of Malcolm X's life, but it's kind of an undervalued part of his life.
You write in the book that, he went fishing for converts,
Yes.
almost by, from a larger Muhammad's directive was to go get young folks. And Malcolm knew from his own life, to go to jazz clubs to find some of those young folks. And you talk about Malcolm in this period of time of being able to effectively and authentically perform, what you describe as Black Atlantic cool. Even in your comments just a moment ago, right? He spoke the language of these young folks. How important do you think it was for him to be able to authentically present himself, and for lack of a better way to describe it, as being a byproduct or a product of the street culture at the time, that made him seem much more authentic to these young folks that he's trying to convert to Islam?
Well, I think it's extremely important because the argument can be made that even in Malcolm X's Nation of Islam speeches, that we can hear the improvisation style
Yeah,
of
yeah,
jazz,
yeah,
that we
yeah.
can, that we can see him performing Black Atlantic Coup in the way he carries himself, and in the way that he mesmerizes his audiences with his with his rapping, with his speeches. And at the same time, he was also, as a Nation of Islam leader, reaching out to important jazz and rhythm and blues singers like Etta James. He had these ongoing relationships with important jazz artists, even when he never really renounced jazz, but of
Yeah,
course, jazz
right.
had to be kind of a bit of an undercurrent of his life once he converted to the Nation of Islam. But those relationships, those connections were still there, and the style, the way that he moved, the way that he walked, the way that he talked, was all formed, as far as I'm concerned, by having been deeply involved in these jazz communities as a teenager.
One of the things that's interesting about the book is when you talk about the city of Boston. And when we think about Boston and race relations, we think about Boston as being generally recognized as one of the quote unquote the most racist major city, one of the most racist major cities in the United States.
And it
But
is.
you actually really describe Boston as an incubator in the 1930s and 40s for a certain kind of Black cultural politics. I was surprised to read, for instance, about the fact that there was a UNIA chapter, in Roxbury, that was deeply connected and helped connect Malcolm when he got there, to these UNI foundational roots that he had in his growing up, and be able to reconnect to those kind of political roots when he gets to Boston through his sister and other folks. Talk a little bit about, why Boston evolved into this space. We talk a lot about Chicago in this era, right? We talk a lot about New York City, even to a lesser extent, a city like Philadelphia, but you really place Boston as a centerpiece of what's happening politically for Black folks in this moment.
Well, I think Boston is underplayed in our histories of this period, because certainly when we look at how Boston emerges in the busing crisis in the 1970s,
70s, yeah.
it is shockingly an extremely racist city on the national civil rights map. But the Black community in Boston, I believe, was always a safe space for musical cultures like jazz. It was a safe space for the Marcus Garvey movement in the 1930s and 1940s, because Boston was one of the big places that Jamaican immigrants chose to settle in.
Mm.
And then there was always this constant interplay between the Black community in Boston and the Black community in New York City, and so that's a very, very important thing, because we see how Malcolm X, sought refuge from all the bad things that were happening to him in the in the Midwest after his father was murdered and his mother was put in in an asylum for the mentally ill. And he came to Boston in the 1940s, and he saw a community of Black homeowners, a small community of Black homeowners, and that's where he settled in with his half sister Ella. But at the same time, we see him moving back and forth between New York City and Boston, and in many different strategic ways, for jazz to move to a larger, more metropolitan city, which New York City was in comparison to Boston. So Boston is definitely underplayed, but at the same time, a lot of the great jazz musicians, they traveled constantly to Boston in the 1940s, 50s, and 1960s. And then there were jazz clubs, all over the Black community of the city in the 1940s. And Malcolm X was a person who frequented these jazz clubs all the time during his teenage years.
That flow between, Boston and New York is important, to remind folks of. I mean, very often, again, when we think about the Black culture in the Northeast in the early 20th century, everything centers on New York and Harlem. And to the extent that we think that there are cultural flows, that the flow is always New York to Washington, D.C., because that's where Howard is, right? So,
Yes,
those
yes.
folks like Elaine Locke are making those, traveling back and forth. But again, you reanimate this other network that's occurring in terms of the exchange of what's happening in Black Boston and what's happening in Harlem and New York. And there's a way in which, you write of jazz musicians and political activists cutting their teeth in Boston and then moving their operations or bringing their talents to New York City, for lack of a better way to describe it.
And I think that's a very important theme because one of the major attractions of Boston is that even in the 1950s, you have Black people coming to Boston to attend the universities, because at the same time, Malcolm X was doing his thing in Boston with the Nation of Islam and with the jazz community. Martin Luther King Jr.
Right.
had moved to Boston, and he was working on his PhD at Boston University School of Theology. That's my alma mater. Went to BU, and he met Coretta Scott King.
Right. Who's also right.
Yeah, in Boston. She was at the New England Conservatory of Music. And I found in my research that there were a number of converts to Islam in Boston who had they had migrated to Boston because they wanted to attend the music schools, the Berklee College of Music,
right.
the New England Conservatory of Music, the Boston Conservatory of Music, and at the same time they also were frequenters at the different jazz clubs throughout the city. And then, of course, C. Eric Lincoln, the person who wrote the Black Muslims, kind of the first authoritative scholarly study of the Nation of Islam, he was doing his PhD also at Boston University School of Theology in the 1950s.
Yeah, I mean, again, to give that kind of weighty presence to Boston, I think, is an important aspect of your contribution to this book. One of the other interesting contributions is, of course, that, when we hear African-American Islam or Black Muslims, we immediately think about the Nation of Islam, right? And in more contemporary moments, we might think about, quote unquote, more traditional Sunni Islam. But you talk a great deal in the book about the influence of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, particularly in Boston, and the way that it dramatically impacts upon jazz musicians and others. Talk a little bit about the Ahmadiyya Muslim community.
Well, they were a great influence on the jazz musicians from the 1940s into the 1960s. They actually, as Indian missionaries, having come to the United States in the 1920s specifically, to do missionary work among African Americans, they had a great outreach, conscious outreach to Black musicians. And we can read in Dizzy Gillespie's autobiography, To Be or Not to Bob, how he was greatly impressed by the number of his musicians who had converted to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the 1940s. And then Malcolm X's best friend in Boston, Malcolm Shorty Jarvis, was a professional musician when he was 16 years old. And, he would sit in with Duke Ellington when Duke Ellington came to town. And he also was one of the people who provided entrees into the world of jazz musicians to Malcolm X. But Malcolm Shorty Jarvis introduced Malcolm X to an Ahmadiyya jazz musician who was living in what later became the Black community. Because you have to realize that Roxbury, at the time when Malcolm X lived there, that was 1940s into the early 1950s, was still kind of 85% a white American community. And you had 15% of Black Americans living in that place, and they were primarily homeowners and small business owners. But Malcolm Shorty Jarvis had met a person who was a missionary for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in Roxbury, and he was dressed distinctively and invited Shorty Jarvis to his home. And the missionary could really play the piano. He had a grand piano in his home. So Shorty Jarvis was fascinated by that. And he also began to introduce Shorty Jarvis and Malcolm X to the religion of Islam. You know, he was trying to convert them to Islam, to show them that there was a better life than the life that they were living in Boston as teenagers. You know, they were involved in some drug dealing. Malcolm X was. He was a dealer of reefer to musicians up and down the East Coast. So that's another way. He knew a lot of the jazz musicians.
He's selling sandwiches and nickel bags at the same time.
Well, by the time he was selling nickel bags, he had stopped working as a sandwich man on the trains. Gotcha. You know, he believed he had graduated to a better way of making money, you know, through hustling and through these connections with the jazz community. So there's a lot going on there with the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, because they were focused very specifically on trying to convert jazz musicians to their version of Islam in the 1940s and 50s.
You cite two jazz musicians. I mean, really recovered two jazz musicians. You know, Eddie Gregory, who converts and becomes Sahib Shahab, Gladstone Scott, you know, who becomes Ghulam Sadiq. These are figures that have been lost to jazz history in some ways, and even doubly so when you consider their impact in terms of Islam. Talk about those two and other figures that need to be recovered that were really critical to introducing Islam to the jazz community.
Well, I think one of the big figures who introduced Islam to the jazz community, and we don't really talk about him in this manner, was Art Blakey. Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, because Art Blakey converted to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. He did that primarily, he said, because he was going down south and playing jazz and in Black Southern communities with a lot of white supremacy, and he was viciously attacked by a white person who hit him in the head, so that he had to have a steel plate put in his head, and that made him question the Christianity that he shared with the white American community, and made him more receptive to Islam. And so Art Blakey was one of those major figures who converted a lot of jazz musicians in his apartment in New York City. It was primarily of course, the Ahmadiyya presentation of Islam. And then we also have to remember Max Roach and Abbey Lincoln. Because Max Roach converted to Sunni Islam, and of course, he and Abbey Lincoln did that iconic album, We Insist, Freedom Now Sweet. He fell in love with Abbey Lincoln and believed that she was a great singer in her own right, but she was kind of being sold as a sex symbol of a singer. Right. But he believed that she could transcend that and perform a higher level of politically conscious jazz. And they married one another. She did convert to Islam. And the combination of the two together gives us one of the most important politically conscious jazz albums that's ever been made. And of course, Max Roach later on becomes a professor of music, of jazz music at University of Massachusetts Amherst, because once he converted to Islam, and he talked about, why he converted a lot. And he put out this, kind of very militant message about the linkages between jazz and the Black Power movement. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to get a lot of club dates after that. And then we don't want to undervalue Etta James's influences, because Etta James's story I found was very, very fascinating, because Malcolm X would visit her when she performed in New York City, and she stayed at the Teresa Hotel. And she did convert to Islam because I found out through my research that when she was growing up in Southern California, both she and her mother were actually going to Nation of Islam meetings in Los Angeles. And then she converted to the Nation of Islam, stayed with Nation of Islam for a while. And she was the first person who actually tried to convert Cassius Clay to the Nation of Islam, because he, when he came to New York City as a very young boxer, he would meet her after hours, but she wasn't successful in converting him when she was trying to do that.
What's fascinating about that particular story, I mean, Ali, Cassius Clay, it's the most famous, convert to Islam in that period of time.
Yes.
And, what your book reveals is the extent that, the conversion to Islam, particularly among entertainers and musicians, was much more widespread than we've ever given any indication of. Quite frankly, I was surprised to read, two favorites of mine, right, who also played together, Lee Morgan and also Grant Green, had converted to the Nation of Islam. I mean, that's actually shocked me, because it's not something that we typically think about when we talk about their art. Obviously, unlike Cassius Clay, they didn't change their name, so it wasn't as visible to us.
Yes.
But I think it's a big deal. It speaks a great deal to how impactful Islam was for this community in this period of time, and how successful the Nation of Islam in particular was for generating, highly visible, if you will, converts, to their practice.
And, also, Mark, these lesser known jazz musicians that you mentioned in Boston during the World War II era, they also point out to us how important those music conservatories in Boston were as a breeding ground for for highly trained jazz musicians who studied at New England Conservatory of Music, Boston Conservatory of Music, and then at the same time they came under the influence of Nation of Islam or Sunni Islam or Ahmadiyya Muslim community in Boston. And then also part of the Boston linkage has to do with my own family in Boston, because my mother and father were migrants, World War II migrants to Boston in the 1940s when they were young married couple. And then, as I was growing up in Boston, actually I saw how important these linkages in the Nation of Islam with Sunni Islam were in the Black community, because as I was growing up, a number of my friends, some of them were musicians, were converting to Sunni Islam, some were converting to Nation of Islam. And then Boston, like New York City and like Chicago, had this public landscape where Muslims who are selling their newspapers and preaching occupied a space just about every single day of the week. And if you're going to take the train or take the bus someplace, they would sell you a newspaper, or if they couldn't sell it to you, if you didn't have the money, they give you a newspaper. They try to preach to you and tell you you're not a Negro, you're a Black person, you have a history before slavery, and you should come to this meeting. And Boston is kind of one of those very important breeding grounds on the East Coast for jazz musicians in this era, from the post-World War II period to the Civil Rights Movement to the Black Power Movement. And I see these different fascinating linkages, both musically, politically, in terms of travel, between the three cities that I talk about in my book: Boston, New York, and Philadelphia.
One of the things you talk about, to shift a little bit, the jazz State Department tours.
Yes.
And I think about this in a couple of contexts. I mean, there's something that fundamentally changed in early hip hop. Chuck, he talks about this all the time, when they finally got a chance to travel, not only nationally, but international travel, right? How it dramatically impacted their, perspective on what was happening in the US and elsewhere. For this generation of jazz musicians in the 1940s, 50s, certainly the 50s and early 60s, it was through these State Department tours that they got to see the world, right, and contextualize religious practice and other things. I was struck recently, there was an article in The Guardian about Louis Armstrong, and the article suggested that his visit to the Congo and his performances in the Congo were used as kind of a Trojan horse, to hide folks to the fact that, at the same time they were killing Patrice Lumumba. And that's just one particular context for this story, but could you unpack a little bit how significant these State Department tours were for jazz musicians in this particular period?
Well, they were extremely important, and actually Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was one of the initiators of these State Department tours, and Dizzy Gillespie was one of the was a part of the first group of those great jazz musicians who traveled to Muslim majority countries. And although Dizzy Gillespie, he didn't convert to Islam, he did think about converting to Islam, but he said he was reading the Quran, partly because of these travels to Muslim majority countries. He actually converted to the Baha'i faith. And even Duke Ellington, who is somebody who certainly did not convert to Islam, but I found that he was really shaped musically by the indigenous musicians that he encountered on the streets when he did concerts in Muslim majority countries. And he was completely embraced by the Muslim communities when he did these State Department sponsored tours in Muslim majority countries, because I found out the Smithsonian Archives, programs of his concerts in several Middle Eastern Muslim countries, and the programs are written in Arabic, and they are praising Duke Ellington, praising his music. And Duke Ellington admitted that although he didn't convert to Islam, that actually when he did a musical concert in Dakar, Senegal, he believed that he had returned to the roots of the type of music that he was playing. And he said that the type of music that he was playing was African-inspired music. So many of these great jazz musicians traveled through the U.S. State Department to Muslim majority countries, and their music was deeply shaped by what they learned musically and politically, and they saw these parallels between the anti-colonial struggles of both Black people and brown people in Africa, in the Middle East, and what was going on in the United States through the Civil Rights Movement and eventually the Black Power Movement.
I have a full circle question for you, Richard.
Okay.
Thinking about this kind of golden age of African American Islam and jazz, would you roughly link from the late 1940s until the late 1970s? And it's kind of a chicken and the egg question, right? Because the high point, for instance, of Nation of Islam membership, right, is the 70s and the 80s, right? It's become an older organization now. Membership has waned. You go to a jazz club, even in 2021, with all the interest in Black culture, You go to someplace like the Blue Note even now, or at least before the pandemic, and the majority of folks sitting in the Blue Note are not Black folks.
Yeah.
There are very few, Black jazz clubs in Black communities anymore. Would you say that the demise of the influence of Islam in Black communities has something to do with the demise of jazz as a popular form in those same Black communities? I think what's important when you talk about Malcolm X's influence early 1950s, jazz music was the music of young folks. What happens when jazz music no longer fills that role for young people, for young Black Americans?
Well, there could be something to your full circle perspective, because I think I make the case in the book that, when John Coltrane died, and he died in the late 1960s.
1967, yeah.
Yeah, and he was just a young man. That also signaled the beginning of the end of this important political and musical age of jazz in the United States. And certainly, at the same time that these different changes were happening, Malcolm X was assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, all assassinated at a very young age, even earlier, Medgar Evers, and then, members of Fred Hampton in the Black Power movement, 1969. You certainly do have a shift at the same time of some of the most influential Black political leaders who were political leaders of a younger generation, both civil rights and Black power leaders, disappearing completely from the political scene. And at the same time, jazz has become a highly commercialized musical form. In this period in the late 1970s, it's no longer just this kind of internal music that comes out of the the historic Black communities on the East Coast and Midwest and the West Coast. But also, I think that there, of course, is a shift in the musical forms that marginalized young people are embracing, because at the same time that jazz is becoming less influential among young people, and and unfortunately, we're beginning to see the demise of the civil rights and the Black power movements. Hip hop is emerging on the scene in New York, in New York City by the mid 1970s. And of course, many of the early hip hop artists were very, very fascinated by Malcolm X. They iconicized Malcolm X and different aspects of his life, and they also were great converts to various Islamic communities, from Nation of Islam to primarily Nation of Islam and Sunni Islam,
and 5% Nation,
and 5% Nation. I can't forget 5% Nation, Rakim. Yes.
We've been talking today with Professor Richard Brent Turner, Professor of African American Religious Studies at the University of Iowa. He's the author of several books: Islam in the African American Experience, which is now in its second edition; Jazz, Religion, the Second Line in Black New Orleans After Hurricane Katrina, which is also in its second edition. And we just talked with Professor Turner about his brand new book, Soundtrack to a Movement: African American Islam, Jazz, and Black Internationalism, published by New York University Press. As always, Richard, it is good to commune with you again and to talk to you about your fascinating and impactful work and body of work now on African-American Islam in this country.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. And it was great seeing you again.
Thank you, Richard.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything.